Honey, let's go to our hometown Gosong. Let's
live there, just taking care of your health. At that single warm remark from my wife, I sold our apartment in Seoul and buried everything in Goseong, Gangwon-do. One winter night, as heavy rain poured down, I clutched my chest and called 119, but the answer I received was cold. The snowplow needs to go in first. Please wait. It was at 3 a.m. as my 60-year-old wife shoveled snow in the bitter cold, shedding tears of blood to save me as I was losing my breath from angina, that I realized something. I realized that this picturesque country house, into which we had poured 700 million won, was actually a glamorous prison that had trapped us. That romance is a luxury that exists only within a system. The house into which we poured our entire life savings is now left empty. The real reason why there are so many empty houses in Gangwon-do begins now. Before the story begins, please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. This is a channel that delivers the hidden stories of ordinary people every day. I am Han Sang-gu, and I am 60 years old this year. I first entered the religious order at the age of 32. I stood before children for a full 30 years. From classrooms where chalk dust flew to whiteboards filled with the smell of markers. Even though times have changed, I have always been in that same spot. When I stood before the children, my back stiffened, and my voice grew tight. That was my life. I have never once taken lightly the sense of stability that comes with being a civil servant. A salary that wasn't lavish, yet wasn't lacking. An unwavering workplace. Within that sanctuary, I raised my son Junho and grew old side by side with my wife. Unlike others, I never dabbled in the stock market, nor did I listen to strange investment talk, just diligently and honestly. That was the only way I knew. Yet, at the age of 62, I put an end to my 30-year teaching career. One day, just a month before my retirement, though I hadn't told my wife, I had been having a strange feeling for months. A heavy sensation in my chest when climbing stairs or lifting heavy objects. Since it would go away after a short rest, I simply assumed it was just the effects of aging. I thought it was just fatigue. I thought it was just a lack of exercise. I didn't think much of it. But one day, while climbing the stairs, I stopped for a moment. I felt a quite strong tightening sensation in the center of my chest. No one noticed, but that was the first time I felt a little scared. When I told my wife about it, she immediately said, "Honey, let's get a health checkup." I can't even remember when we last had one. To be honest, I have lived my life without paying much attention to my health. If I felt a bit unwell, I just endured it, and I thought that if I was tired, I could simply sleep. Whenever my wife suggested going to the hospital, I would constantly say, "I'm fine, I don't have any pain." But this time, for some reason, I obediently followed along. Was my heart softening a bit with retirement approaching? My wife and I visited a local internal medicine clinic together for tests. We underwent endoscopy, had blood drawn, had an electrocardiogram, and had our blood pressure checked. While the doctor meticulously examined everything, I wasn't thinking much about it. My wife muttered softly beside me, "What if something weird comes out?" But I laughed it off, saying, "It's fine. What could possibly come out?" We agreed to hear the results in a week. In the meantime, I was busy preparing for retirement. I handed over my duties to a junior teacher and packed up my things. As I pulled out items from my desk drawer, old class photos, bundles of letters from the children, those faces from back then came to mind. I felt so proud when the kid who used to be a snorty sent me the news that he was getting married. Time really flies. It was Thursday afternoon when we went to the hospital to hear the results. My wife and I sat side by side in the examination room chairs. The doctor looked at the monitor and spoke slowly. "The results for both of you are in. Patient Lee Myung-suk is generally in good condition. Her blood pressure is slightly high, but it is not at a level to worry about too much." My wife breathed a sigh of relief. "But what about patient Han Sang-gu?" The doctor paused for a moment. I straightened my back for no reason. "There are some abnormal findings. There is a possibility of angina, so you should undergo a detailed heart examination. Your blood pressure is also at a level that requires management. Your fasting blood sugar is slightly above the normal range, so while you do not have diabetes right now, you need to be careful." The examination room fell silent. The word angina struck me. I knew it was about the heart. That word, which I had only vaguely known about, had now become my story. Is it very serious? My wife asked first. Her voice trembled. You just need to manage it well. However, you must not overexert yourself. You also need to reduce stress. Avoid strenuous exercise. Light walking is best. Eat less salt as well. For now, I think it would be best to go to a large hospital and get a detailed examination. A few days later, I visited a university hospital with my wife. We underwent various additional tests. The results were clear. It was early-stage angina. Just as the doctor said, it wasn't at an immediate dangerous stage, but they told me it could worsen at any time if not managed properly. Those words lingered in my mind for days. On the way back, neither of us spoke a word. My wife held my hand on the bus. She didn't say a word, just held it tightly. I couldn't find the words to speak either. The scenery of Seoul during rush hour flashed by outside the window. Dense buildings, people rushing back and forth. I had lived my whole life in this environment, but that day, it all felt strangely unfamiliar. We returned home and had dinner. My wife served me side dishes without a word, and I ate them in silence. After finishing my rice, I was the first to speak. I told you it's not that serious. I know. So don't worry too much. My wife lowered her cloak and looked at me. Honey, are you sure you're worried? Of course I am. But she paused for a moment before continuing. There is something I've been thinking about for a long time. I waited in silence. You know my hometown, Gosong? How about we move down there in Gangwon-do? It was an unexpected suggestion. I stopped picking up my chopsticks. Gosong? Yeah. The air is clean, there's the sea, and there are mountains behind. What's the point of living in Seoul like this, struggling so hard? I hear your health isn't great, so why don't you take your time and live there? It's where I lived when I was little. It's a really wonderful place. There was strength in my wife's voice. I could feel that these were words she had cherished for a long time. I thought for a while. Goseong, Gangwon-do. It was the hometown where her eyes would sparkle whenever she occasionally spoke of her childhood. The Gosong she spoke of was always green, vast, and refreshing. Will my health improve if we go there? I asked. My wife nodded firmly. It will. For some reason, I believed her words. My wife had rarely been wrong. For the first time in her life, my wife, who had lived silently behind the scenes for the family, was suggesting we go to a place she wanted. I thought that might be her final dream. A life spent slowly recovering my health by her side in her hometown didn't seem so bad. Okay, let's think about it, I said. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept deeply. It was a dream where a blue sea stretched out before me, and a single white house stood right in front of it. My wife was waving from the yard. It was a pretty good dream for a night, right before retirement. Okay. What started as a suggestion to think about it had somehow turned into a, yes, let's go. That's just how the human heart works, I guess. Once you start leaning in, it becomes uncontrollable. Before going to bed, I watched videos of country houses on YouTube, and when I woke up in the morning, I browsed through Gangwon-do real estate forums. My wife was doing the same. One day, I noticed a book about moving to the countryside sitting on the dining table. I didn't even know when it had been bought. It was about a month after I retired that my wife and I first visited Gosong. As we drove on the highway into Gangwon-do, the wide-open East Sea unfolded before our eyes as soon as we emerged from a tunnel. My wife let out a small gasp of awe from the passenger seat. I slowed down without even realizing it. It was a color that was more than just sold. It was a color I had never seen while living in Seoul. We drove around the town of Goseong and stopped by a real estate agency. The agency owner took us around here and there, showing us properties. A piece of land on a hill overlooking the sea, situated next to a pine forest with a mountain behind and a field stretching out in front. The more I looked at it, the more I coveted it. The land, which was a size unimaginable in Seoul, was not as expensive as I had expected. My wife spoke in a low voice. Honey, don't you think your health would improve if we built a house here and lived? I nodded in agreement. The air was different, even the wind. Something that had always weighed heavily on us in Seoul was absent here. It felt like my chest was opening up. Ever since hearing about my angina, a part of my heart had always felt heavy, but on that day it felt a bit lighter. That evening, I sat across from my wife at our accommodation. "How was it?" she asked. I thought for a moment and replied, "It was nice." "Me too." That was all. No long explanation was needed. Both of us had already made up our minds. We signed the contract for the land the very next week. It was a spot embraced by a low mountain behind and with the distant sea visible in front. The moment I saw it, I knew this was the one. My wife felt the same way. My hand trembled slightly as I stamped the contract. It was a trembling. I couldn't tell if it was excitement or nervousness. We commissioned the design and began construction. We drew out the house we wanted. It didn't have to be anything grand. We wanted a yard, plenty of sunlight, and spacious rooms. My wife insisted on including a space for a vegetable garden, and I requested large windows overlooking the outside. The day we first received the blueprints, the two of us spread them out on the dining table and stared at them for a long time. We discussed how to use this room and how to utilize that space. I really enjoyed that time. They said the construction would take about 5 months. We decided to put our sole apartment on the market around the time the construction was finished. Our apartment was located on the outskirts of Seoul. It wasn't exactly a prime location, but it was a spot my wife had chosen 10 years ago. Back then, I went along without much thought, but before I knew it, the value had gone up quite a bit. Living here, I've thought several times that I made the right decision listening to her back then. The market value of the apartment was around 600 million won. Adding my 100 million won severance pay and the 200 million won in savings I had accumulated, it amounted to quite a substantial sum. While it was far from enough to buy a house in Seoul, it seemed more than sufficient to build a home in the countryside and spend my retirement. The thought that we would have more than enough to build a magnificent house there naturally came out of my mouth. My wife laughed too. While the construction was underway, we went down to Goseong every weekend. We stood side by side watching the foundation work come up, the framework erected and the roof placed on top. My wife looked at the spot for the vegetable garden and talked about what we would plant when spring arrived. I sat on the porch, imagining the view through that window. I always felt good in the car on the way back to Seoul. Yet, a small spark was igniting in the back of my mind. We had an initial budget, but as the construction progressed, the situation kept changing. We had to build a retaining wall. Material costs had gone up. This part required extra work. At first, I just accepted it. They said that's just how building a house is. However, every time the topic of additional costs came up, it stung a little. Still, the work had already begun. I couldn't stop it. My son, Junno, called. "Dad, will the construction go well?" "Yes, it's going well." "What about the hospital there?" "Dad, he has angina, so it's in the ward." "Don't worry." "Father?" "Junno, I've thought everything through." Junno couldn't find the words to say more. He said he was rooting for me, but his voice was filled with worry. I thought his worries were unfounded. At the time, that was how it seemed. Around the time the construction was nearing completion, I put the apartment up for sale. On the day I signed the contract, my hands trembled strangely. It was the house where I had lived for 10 years. Junno had prepared for his teacher certification exam in this house, spent the night before his wedding here, and had dinner here on the day he received his first paycheck. Those memories flooded back all at once. My wife held my hand tightly beside me. "You're doing the right thing," she said. At those single words, the trembling in my hands stopped. I had also meticulously planned out our retirement expenses. How much for building the house, how much for living expenses, and how much for reserves. I checked the calculations, writing them down neatly on paper. There was also a pension. Every time the numbers matched up in my own house and on my own land, I straightened my shoulders. My wife was beside me, poring over a book about moving to the countryside. "Honey, I want to plant lettuce and peppers in the vegetable garden." "Go ahead, do it." "What do you want to do?" I thought for a moment. "I just want to rest. Do nothing." My wife laughed. It was an angry smile I hadn't seen in a long time. Just like that, our move to the countryside was confirmed. It was the day the stage for the act of our lives was set. Thinking back now on how excited we were both back then makes me blush a little. We really had no idea what lay ahead. The house was completed. It feels like just yesterday that we spread out the blueprints and stood there talking about this and that, but suddenly, a real house was right before our eyes. It was a spot embraced by mountains in the back and with the sea visible in the distance in front. There was a yard, and the vegetable garden spot my wife had wanted so much. The feeling I had when I first stood on the land, that this was the place, was not wrong. However, there was an emotion that arose before joy. It was a sense of necessity. The construction wasn't supposed to take 5 months. Due to various reasons, it dragged on, eventually taking nearly 7 months. During that time, I repeatedly traveled back and forth between Seoul and Goseong. There were many days when I would go down every weekend to check the site, listen to the contractors, and return to Seoul, only to be so exhausted that I fell silent. The problem was money. When I first set the budget, I calculated everything meticulously. I am a person whose 30 years of civil service are second nature. I have never been careless in the face of numbers. However, the rural construction site was different from the world of principles I had lived in. They said we had to build retaining walls. They claimed it was unavoidable because the land was sloped. At first I thought it was included, but it turned out to be separate. There was also talk that material costs had risen. We changed the design slightly midway through construction, and that incurred additional costs as well. I accepted each one individually, but as they piled up, it became unmanageable. I am someone who believes in doing things according to the rules. I thought adhering strictly to the blueprints and the contract was the right thing to do, but the contractors on site were different. This is how we always do it here. Is it different from the city? Boss, if we don't do it this way, we'll have bigger problems later. Those words won out every time. After all, they weren't wrong. That made me feel even more frustrated. It cost 600 million won to buy the land and build the country house. However, the cost far exceeded the initial budget. How much more did it cost? It was 100 million won more than I had initially anticipated. I started by combining the money from selling our apartment, my retirement allowance, and even my savings, but after the house was built, I had very little money left in my hands. Only about 200 million won remained. The money I needed for my retirement living expenses had decreased much more than I had expected. That night, my wife took out the bank book, stared at it for a long time without saying a word, and then quietly closed it. I pretended not to know. Actually, I already knew. I knew how much the balance was and whether it was sufficient or not. But at least for that night, I didn't want to bring it up. The house was already built, and we had already come this far. Honey, my wife called. Yeah. As long as we live well, that's all that matters. Those words were a comfort. I could feel that we shared the same feelings without needing a long explanation. We are moving in the fall. We unpacked, delivered the furniture, and hung the curtains. The household items we used in Seoul gradually found their places in the 3 spaces. It felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comfortable. Sitting on the porch and looking out the window, I could see the sea in the distance. The evening sunlight settled upon it. It was the tranquility we had worn for so long. From the day we moved, my wife had been ambitious about the vegetable garden. It was already late autumn, so it was well past the time to plant anything, but she still kept looking at the soil. I'll plant lettuce, perilla leaves, and peppers next year, she muttered to herself. I listened beside her, smiling. However, that winter was not easy. The winter in Gangwon-do was on a completely different level from Seoul. It snowed heavily, and the wind was biting. I had braced myself for that. The problem was the rain in the master bedroom. I thought the newly built house would be well insulated, but the structure of a country house was different from an apartment. With high ceilings and a large area, it took a long time to clean, and when I received the bill on the first day, I stared at it for a long time. It was well over double what we paid when we lived in an apartment. I told my wife it was just because it was the first month, but inwardly, I was quite shocked. The second and third months weren't much different. Winter in Gangwon-do was long. Winter passed, and spring came. My wife started tending the vegetable garden. She turned over the soil with a small trowel, made furrows, and planted seedlings one by one. I crouched down beside her to help. The smell of the soil was lovely. It was a scent I had never encountered in Seoul. What is this? I asked, looking closely at one of the seedlings. It's a perilla leaf. I didn't know. I just didn't know perilla leaves looked like this. My wife chuckled. What have you been eating at the dinner table all this time? I laughed at her words. For the first time in a long while, I laughed so hard my belly hurt. It was a day when lettuce sprouted, chili peppers bloomed, and perilla leaves grew wide. My wife placed a plate of lettuce from the garden on the dinner table. As I wrapped rice in the lettuce we had grown ourselves, it tasted strangely different. I couldn't explain what made it different from what we usually bought at the supermarket, but it was just different. "It's delicious, isn't it?" my wife asked. "Yeah, it is." "Then that's all that matters." Just for that evening, I put my worries about our bank account aside for a moment. An evening breeze blew across the yard. The sun was setting over the mountains. My wife sat perched on the edge of the porch gazing at the vegetable garden. I sat beside her. Neither of us said a word. It would be a lie to say we weren't worried about money. I knew, even without saying it, that we didn't have enough money left. But at that moment, simply knowing that this was our home was enough. There was a yard smelling of soil, a porch where the breeze blew in, and someone sharing dinner beside us. It was an expensive house. It cost much more than I had expected. However, sitting on that porch that evening, I still hadn't fully grasped just how big of a problem it was. After all, the real problems hadn't arrived yet. Spring was wonderful. New sprouts emerged in the vegetable garden, the wind blew through the yard, and I woke up every morning to the sound of birds. It was a morning I could never have imagined in Seoul. When I opened the window, the scent of the mountains wafted in, and in the evenings, the sunset filled the yard. I thought, so this is what country life is. I felt like this was exactly why I had come here. But as that spring transitioned into summer, something began to change. It was weeds. At first, I thought I could just pull them out. I didn't think it was a big deal if a few were popping up in one corner of the yard. But the summer in Gangwon-do was different. After just one rain, they grew by the day. They had grown again the moment I turned my back. They were back in the very spot I had pulled yesterday. The yard and the area around the vegetable garden would be covered in green in an instant if I let my guard down even for a moment. I bought a brush cutter. At first I thought I handled it quite well. However, operating the brush cutter under the thick summer grass was no easy task. In less than 30 minutes, my back was drenched in sweat. I was out of breath. I felt a heavy sensation in my chest. Although I knew I shouldn't overexert myself due to angina, I simply couldn't leave these weeds alone. My wife told me to stop, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. One day, I strained my lower back. I had slipped while operating the brush cutter. That evening, I lay there unable to move. My wife applied a patch without saying a word. Her silence felt even heavier. Staring at the ceiling, I had a thought. Country life isn't about enjoying it, but about enduring it through labor. The rural life I saw on YouTube was different. It was a picture of sitting on a yard chair, drinking a cup of coffee, picking vegetables from the garden, and grilling a barbecue in the evening. But reality was different. There was no time to sit on a yard chair. I operated the brush cutter, tended to the house, and cleared trees. I used my body much more than when I worked in Seoul. Then, there was a village matter. The village head came to visit a few months after I had moved in. He said he was collecting a village development fund. The amount itself wasn't the issue. I simply handed it to him and said a few words. Being someone whose life as a civil servant was ingrained in him, it came out naturally. "Do you have receipts or a simple breakdown of expenses? I think it would be good to know where and how the money is being spent." The village head's face hardened. "Sir, do you know what kind of neighborhood we are? These are people who have lived by faith for decades. Are you asking me to prove that with receipts?" I was flustered. That wasn't what I meant. I simply thought that transparent management would be good for everyone. However, the village head already looked visibly displeased. I regretted not just giving it to him, but the damage was done. The weeds weren't pulled out by the roots, and the misunderstanding remained unresolved. Something changed after that day. Even when I ran into the village elders, things weren't the same as before. Even when I greeted them, they responded more briefly than before. When I went to village gatherings, I felt like I was the only one left out. No one was saying anything to my face, but I could sense the atmosphere. Before I knew it, I had become a fussy old man from Seoul in this village. I am not the type to care much about what others think of me. I spent 30 years teaching. I believed that sticking to the rules was enough. So at first, I tried not to care. I asked myself, I haven't done anything wrong, so why should I feel intimidated? But once I actually found myself drifting alone in the village, it wasn't that easy. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it feels like to be isolated in a place where I didn't know a single face. That night, my wife was out in the yard alone. She didn't come back even after a long time had passed. When I went out to see her, I found her standing in one corner of the yard, gazing into the darkness. There were many stars in the sky. It was a sky rarely seen in Seoul. "Why aren't you coming in?" I asked. After a long pause, my wife spoke. "You told me you lived here when you were young. There are no people I know, and nothing feels familiar. I guess the hometown I dreamed of wasn't here." Her voice was quiet. It wasn't resentment, nor was it anger. It was just calm, but that weighed on my mind even more. I couldn't say a word. I didn't know what to say. Saying "I'm sorry" felt awkward, and saying "it's okay" felt even more so. I just stood beside my wife, and we looked up at the sky together. There were so many stars. But that night, those stars didn't look pretty to me. After a while, my wife went inside first. I remained alone in the yard, standing there for a little longer. The sound of crickets filled the air. It was a night that seemed quiet, yet was actually noisy. The word "stranger" kept swirling in my head. They said it was my wife's hometown, but we were both strangers here. I didn't know then whether the villagers in this land needed time for an old man from Seoul to settle in, or if this place simply wasn't right for us to begin with. The summer was long. Weeds kept growing, my back ached often, and no one in the village called for me. My wife tended the vegetable garden steadily. She didn't speak, but her expression looked at ease only when she touched the soil. For me, that was at least a relief. Still, I endured. I thought I couldn't back down like this after coming this far. Just a little more, just a little more. Repeating those words to myself, I got through the summer. I believed that things would get better when autumn came, that things would change once I got used to it. But reality did not unfold according to my beliefs. Chuseok was approaching. My wife had brought it up 2 months before the holiday. "How about Junwon comes here for Chuseok this year?" She spoke lightly, but her eyes held a different look. Since coming to Goseong, I hadn't seen my grandson's face. I had only seen him in photos. I knew how much my wife missed him. Because I missed him too. I called Juno. "Can you come down for Chuseok this year?" "Ah, yes, father. But won't the traffic be really bad if we go all the way to Goseong during the holidays?" "So what? That's just how the holidays are. Let's spend time together for the first time in a while." A brief silence followed. "Okay. I'll come down." After hanging up, I spoke to my wife. Her face lit up instantly. That expression alone was enough. My wife began to get ready. I started grocery shopping a week before the holiday. I even went to the market twice. We talked for days about what to make, what my grandchild would like, and whether we should prepare something special since the child had just turned 1 and couldn't eat adult food. Although I was busy doing all of that right beside him, I was actually looking forward to it myself. On the morning of the holiday, I received a text from Juno. "Dad just left, but the traffic is already really bad." I told him it was okay to take his time and to drive carefully. But it wasn't that he was taking his time. The car just wasn't moving. Usually it takes 2.5 to 3 hours to get to Goseong, but the highway was different that day during the holidays. Texts came in one by one. "I'm still getting out of Seoul." An hour later, another one came. "It's really congested." It wasn't until well over 5 hours later that Juno finally pulled into the yard. The car door opened, and my daughter-in-law got out holding the child. My wife ran over. I followed her out as well. My grandson, who had just turned 1, looked around with wide eyes, fascinated by the unfamiliar place. My wife took him into her arms, her eyes welling up with tears. "Grandma's here, my little darling." Her voice trembled. Junno spoke as he unloaded the luggage from the car. "Dad, what are you doing?" It was more than I expected. "The traffic was terrible. You worked hard. Let's go inside." My daughter-in-law greeted us. She looked tired. After being in the car for over 5 hours with the child, I can only imagine how exhausted she must have been. The dinner table was bountiful. The dishes my wife had spent days preparing were laid out on the table. Jun-no had even mentioned the seasoned braised ribs earlier, saying, "Mother, you made too much." But my wife kept bringing out more and more dishes. It was a meal where the family had gathered for the first time in a long while. I thought to myself, this is what a holiday is all about. The child, fascinated by the unfamiliar surroundings, went around touching everything. He tried to go out to the yard and the vegetable garden, and my wife followed him around, laughing. I also stood beside him, acting as his walking partner. For the first time in a long while, the house was bustling with activity. It was nice. I never knew that such sounds would be so welcome. However, starting the evening of the next day, the child began to fuss. He wouldn't eat well and kept whining. My daughter-in-law placed her hand on the child's forehead, and her expression hardened. "Mother, I think the child has a fever." My wife quickly came over and confirmed this. "Yeah, he does have a bit." My daughter-in-law took a fever monitor out of her bag. When we checked, it was over 38 degrees. It is a cold he has been living with ever since he started attending daycare. They say all kids go through this when they go to daycare, and that scares me so much. It breaks my heart that I can't even look after him because of work. I gave him the herbal medicine my daughter-in-law had brought. The child resisted taking the medicine, refusing to eat it, but finally managed to take it. He fell asleep only after I soothed him for quite a while. My daughter-in-law couldn't sleep that night. I checked on the child's condition in between and reevaluated the trip schedule. I woke up once at dawn myself, and the light was on. My daughter-in-law was sitting beside the child. I quietly closed the door. The next morning, while we were eating breakfast, Jun-no spoke quietly. "Father, I think we have to go back up today." I stopped picking up my spoon. "You should have stayed one more day already. The child has a fever. I think it would be better to go to a familiar place and rest, and just in case, I think we should see a doctor." He wasn't wrong. I understood. My daughter-in-law bowed her head and said, "Mother, I'm sorry. I want to wear the clothes longer, but I get too anxious if the child is sick. I think we need to take him quickly to the hospital." My wife said, "It's okay, the illness comes first. Go right away." But her voice was a little hoarse. It didn't take long to pack the bags. Going back was much faster than coming. My wife packed various foods for me. As my daughter-in-law took them, she apologized again. Jun-no placed the child in the car seat and closed the car door. "Father, we'll contact you more often next time." "Okay, drive carefully." The car drove out of the yard. My wife stood there, waving her hand until the car was out of sight. I stood beside her. Even after the car rounded the alley and disappeared, my wife remained there for a while. The yard seemed to have suddenly become much larger. Just moments ago, it had been a bustling yard with the child, but now there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Chili peppers in the vegetable garden were ripening red. My wife gazed in that direction for a moment before slowly going inside. I stood alone in the yard for a little longer. I know she didn't leave with bad intentions. I know my daughter-in-law isn't a bad person. When a child is sick, a mother's heart can't help but feel that way. Jun-ho couldn't help it either. He does everything. But even knowing that, a corner of my heart felt empty. Those were faces we had longed to see, and my wife had prepared so much, yet no one could bring themselves to say when we would be able to come next time. When I entered the house, my wife was doing the dishes. As I watched her retreating figure, her shoulders were slumped. Amidst the sound of the water, I heard my wife quietly sniffling. I couldn't say a word. I just went over to her and picked up the dishcloth. Both of them finished washing the dishes in silence. That evening, the two of us ate the leftovers. The table my wife had set was much quieter than yesterday. As I ate, I looked out the window. The wind was blowing across the darkened yard. That day, I realized for the first time just how far away Seoul was, not in terms of physical distance, but in terms of the distance of the heart. Winter came for the second time. The first winter, at least, had a fresh charm. The snow-covered yard was beautiful, and sitting right in front of it felt romantic. Although the heating bill was high and made my stomach ache, it was still bearable. The second winter was different. I already knew. Even though I had braced myself for what kind of winter it would be, how cold, how long, and how much money it would cost, it was still difficult when it actually hit me. That is the nature of determination. Knowing something with your head is different from experiencing it with your body. His winter was unusually snowy. I knew that Gangwon province was known for heavy snow, but it was particularly severe there. Heavy snow advisories appeared frequently on the weather forecast. When it snowed, clearing the yard was no easy task. No matter how much I shoveled, it just piled up again. My back just wouldn't hold up. It hadn't fully recovered from a sprain I sustained in the summer. My wife said, "Honey, I'll help you clear the snow." I insisted, "No thanks. It's faster when you do things together. Just leave it. I'll do it." I didn't want to make my wife clear the snow. But honestly, I was struggling too. My 60-year-old body wasn't what it used to be. Then, one night, I ate dinner, watched TV, and went to bed early. Snow was falling outside. I could see white snowflakes quietly falling through the window. It seemed like a night where I would sleep well. However, I woke up at dawn. It was chest pain. At first, I thought it was just a bit stuffy. Thinking my position might have been uncomfortable while sleeping, I turned over. But it didn't get better. On the contrary, it got worse. It felt like someone was tightly gripping the center of my chest. Even when I tried to take a deep breath, it didn't work well. I broke out in a cold sweat. The word angina flashed through my mind. I had been taking my medication consistently, but the problem was that I had overworked my body too much. I remembered what the doctor had said, that I shouldn't push myself too hard and should reduce my stress. I hadn't been able to fully follow those words. I woke my wife up. "Honey," she said. She got up immediately. She is a light sleeper. Why? Does it hurt? My chest feels a bit off. My wife's face hardened. I turned on the light. She looked at my face and immediately picked up her cell phone. I called 119. The phone rang. I answered. My wife gave the address and explained the situation. However, the response I received wasn't that they would leave immediately. The road conditions aren't good right now. We can only enter once the snowplows get through first. I think you will have to wait a little while. My wife hung up and looked at me. I knew without her saying a word. It wasn't easy. I looked out the window and saw that the snow was heavy. The yard was already covered in white. Even the alley was invisible. That seemingly peaceful white landscape felt terrifying that night. My wife picked up a shovel and tried to go out. "What are you doing?" "You need to clear the road so the ambulance can get in." "How are you supposed to clear it all by yourself?" "But I can't just sit still." I couldn't stop her. My wife went out. I leaned back on the sofa, pressing my hand against my chest. I felt like moving would make things worse. I could hear the sound of my wife shoveling snow outside the window. A woman in her 60s was clearing snow in the middle of the night. Hearing that sound, my eyes grew hot. This isn't what I came here for. How long had I been waiting? I looked at the clock. It had been over 30 minutes since I made the call. The chest pain hadn't subsided. My wife continued shoveling outside while I slumped on the sofa, catching my breath. I can't describe how long that waiting time felt. It was the longest I had ever experienced in my life. It was only after that I finally heard the sound of an ambulance. The snowplow arrived first, followed by the paramedics. When my wife opened the door and walked in, her entire body was covered in snow. Her hands were red and frozen. As she was carried out into the fields, I held her hand. It was cold. So cold. As soon as the paramedic entered and checked her condition, he said, "We have to go to Sokcho." Hearing those words, my wife's face turned pale. I felt a chill for a moment, too. I wondered how long it would take to get from here to Sokcho on a snowy night. But the ambulance set off. The sound of the siren cut through the quiet countryside night. Looking up at the ceiling from inside the car, I thought only that I had to endure it. We arrived at the emergency room. The doctors moved quickly. They performed various tests. My wife waited outside. I later heard that she had sat in a chair praying during that time. After quite a while, the doctor in charge arrived. "You must have been very shocked, right?" For now, you have passed the critical stage. It was just that the symptoms of angina worsened. If we had waited just a little longer, it could have been dangerous. If only we had been a little later. Those words lingered in my ears for a long time. I spent a few days here. My wife was by my side every day. She brought something from home because she said the hospital food was unappetizing. I was grateful for that, but I also felt sorry. My wife's face looked very gaunt. On the day of the birth, we were silent for a while in the car. On the way back home, the snow had stopped. The roads were neatly cleared. The sky was blue. The sky in Gangwon-do was exceptionally blue after the snow. It was beautiful weather. But that blue sky felt strangely unfamiliar to me that day. When we arrived home and stepped into the yard, my wife spoke. "Honey, yes." I was scared. I couldn't say a word. When you said your heart ached, my hands were trembling so much. I was trembling while on the phone, and I was trembling while shoveling snow, but I couldn't just sit still. My wife's voice trembled. I spoke honestly too. I was scared too. I rarely said things like that in my life. The word scared. But that day, those words came out first. I was scared. Really. My wife held my hand. The two of us stood in the yard for a while without saying a word. The wind blew. It was a cold wind, but strangely, at that moment it felt less cold. Neither of us slept well that night. Looking up at the ceiling, I thought, what if something happens to us here? What if the ambulance arrives even later next time? What if my wife collapses while shoveling snow alone? Thoughts spiraled. And for the first time I thought seriously, is it okay for us to be here? For several days after birth, I just lay there. It was partly because my body was weak, but actually, it was because I was so preoccupied with thoughts. I would look at the ceiling, then out the window, then back to the ceiling. My wife silently made sure I ate. She would bring me porridge and remind me to take my medicine. I was grateful for that, yet my heart felt heavy. What if something happens to us here? That thought would not leave me. It wasn't just once, but twice. I didn't know when or how things might turn out next time. That road to the hospital, that time, came back to me. I also recalled the sight of my wife's back as she shoveled snow alone that night. One morning, my wife set the table and sat down, saying, "Honey, let's be honest." I stopped picking up my spoon. "We're thinking the same thing." I nodded. "Let's put the house on the market." Strangely, I felt relieved once I had said it out loud. It was something we had both been holding on to for a long time. It wasn't easy to admit this now, that we had come this far. Memories of the days we went looking at land, the days we laughed over blueprints, and the day we moved in flashed through my mind. But I couldn't help it. My body was sending the signals first. I went to a real estate agency. The owner welcomed me warmly. He was someone who had worked in this neighborhood for a long time. I told him I wanted to put the house on the market. The owner's expression changed for a moment. I could feel him pause briefly as he was about to say something. "Sir, how much are you planning to list it for?" "Considering the cost of building it, I want to get a fair price. Wouldn't that be right?" The owner said slowly. "Sir, may I be honest with you?" I nodded. "We won't be able to recoup the full cost of construction. It's different from Seoul. There are no people moving in, only a line of people wanting to leave. Country houses have always been like that. Young people aren't coming, and those who are here are trying to move out. Do you know why there are so many empty houses? They are all houses with a story." I couldn't say a word. "You have to lower the price significantly. Even then, I'm not sure if anyone will come to look. There aren't just one or two properties on the market around here these days." The owner mentioned a number. It was a price much lower than I had expected. It was just over half of the construction cost. As those numbers hit my ears, my mind went blank. How much have we poured into this place? It meant that we wouldn't even get the full value of the land, construction costs, and all sorts of additional expenses. Even if we put it on the market at that price, people might or might not come to look. Honestly, the owner spoke with an apologetic expression. He wasn't a bad person. He was just telling me the reality. I knew that. But even knowing that, Those words hurt so much. I left the real estate office. My wife was waiting outside. Seeing my expression, she didn't ask anything. Neither of us spoke as we walked home. We stood in front of the house. It was a spot embraced by mountains behind and overlooking the sea in front. It was the very spot I knew was the one the moment I first stood on the land. The roof, the yard, and the vegetable garden were all things we had built with our own hands. The chili peppers my wife had planted in the spring were already all withered. It was winter, after all. My wife said, "What did we bury here?" It wasn't resentment. It was just a remark born of despondency. I felt the same way. I thought I had never been careless in the face of numbers my entire life. I had lived by principles my whole life. I made plans, checked the calculations, and executed them exactly. But this single house had shaken my entire life to its core. The proceeds from the sale of our apartment, my severance pay, my savings, everything I had accumulated throughout my life was buried in this very ground. I felt the strength drain from my knees. It was a sensation I had never felt before in my life. I endured 30 years in the religious community. I endured even after being diagnosed with angina, and I endured even when I wavered throughout the entire communist era, but a single remark from the real estate agent made my legs give way. My wife took my hand. "Honey, at least we are healthy." I couldn't answer. We went inside. My wife brewed tea. The two of us sat on the porch, holding our warm tea and looking out the window. The sea was visible in the distance. It was a winter sea. It was gray. The first time I had seen the sea, it looked so vibrant, but that day, it just looked cold. I thought about it for a few more days. Actually, there was nothing to think about. The answer was already there. It just took time to accept it. It took a few days to come to terms with how much had gone into acquiring this house and how futile it was to put it on the market at this price. And then I made a decision. Whether it sells or not, let's just put it on the market. If I waited until it sold, I would have had to spend the following winter here again. I didn't know what would happen if the same thing happened again the following winter. I told my wife, "Let's put it on the market." No matter the price, she silently nodded. That evening, the two of us sat down and ate dinner. There were only a few side dishes. It was a meal my wife had roughly prepared, but strangely, the food went down well. Perhaps my heart felt a little lighter now that I had made up my mind. The wind blew outside the window. The tree branches swayed. I looked at the tree and thought, that tree must be taking root like that because that is the right place for it. This place just wasn't the right place for us. I hadn't made the wrong choice. It was simply a choice that wasn't right for us. It took 2 years to realize that difference. The house never sold. Even after several months had passed since we put it on the market, no one came to look at it. The real estate agent was right. It was a neighborhood where only people lined up to leave. At first, I held out hope whenever I received a call, but as even that became infrequent, I just gave up. I felt that if I waited any longer, my body wouldn't be able to endure it. So I made a decision. Let's just get out. I decided to view the house simply as an investment, a second home. I resolved to keep it in mind as a place to visit briefly during nice seasons to rest once my health improved. And that shifted my mindset, allowing me to move out. It was true that we had suffered a loss, but I didn't want that house to completely swallow up our lives. We packed our bags. While we had unpacked with excitement when we moved in, we packed silently this time. My wife took a look around the vegetable garden. It was bare earth with nothing in it. It was the very spot where we had planted lettuce, perilla leaves, and chili peppers in the spring. She stood there for a moment, then turned away without a word. I watched her retreating figure. I didn't say a word. The truck washed the belongings and drove away. My wife and I took one last look around the house. The empty rooms felt unfamiliar. Now that all traces of our time here were gone, it felt like we had returned to that empty space from the day we first moved in after the construction was finished. I locked the door one last time and got into the car. On the way out of Goseong, I saw the sea. It was the winter sea. I couldn't remember the last time I gasped in awe at the ocean. My wife was looking out the window. I just looked straight ahead. Once we got onto the highway, neither of us spoke. We returned to Seoul. We rented a small villa near a university hospital. It was a space incomparably smaller than our house in Goseong. There was no yard, no vegetable garden, and neither the sea nor mountains were visible through the window. The buildings were packed tightly together. It was Seoul. As we unpacked, my wife said quietly, "It's cramped." "Yeah, but it's okay." Those words strangely choked me up. On the first night, I saw a light beyond the window. It was the cross-shaped light from the hospital emergency room. The light was quietly lit in the darkness. Memories of that night in Goseong, how far that single light seemed on a night of heavy rain, how long we endured waiting for the ambulance, and how daunting the road to the hospital felt, flashed through my mind all at once. But now, that light was right there. My wife came to sit beside me, where it was visible just by opening the window, and we looked out together. "Honey, do you see that light?" "Huh? I do. Seeing that makes me feel like I can finally live." I felt the same way. It was a sense of relief that was hard to describe in words. There were no mountains, no sea, no yard, yet that single hospital light felt more reassuring than all of them combined. That night, we both fell into a deep sleep. It was the first time in a long while that we had slept soundly since arriving in Goseong. We didn't wake up in the middle of the night, nor did our hearts feel heavy in the early morning. We simply slept and woke up. In the morning, my wife cooked breakfast. I heard rustling sounds coming from the small kitchen. I heard them from under the covers. There was the smell of something boiling. It seemed like soybean paste stew. Even in Goseong, my wife cooked breakfast every morning. I can't explain exactly what was different from back then, but that morning, the smell felt more comforting. Our finances were tight. We had money tied up at the house in Goseong, and the remaining funds weren't exactly ample either. However, our pensions came in. The savings from my 30 years of teaching were deposited into our account every month. We cut back on eating out and saved money. It wasn't affluent, but we were able to endure. We paid rent, ate, and went to the doctor. That was how we managed to live. Junno came over with our grandchild. He came even though it wasn't a holiday. Since we were in Seoul now, it was close. As my daughter-in-law came in holding the baby, she said, "Mother, I'll come often now." My wife's face lit up. I found myself smiling without realizing it. In Goseong, we used to stay for just one day during the holidays before returning because the child was sick, but now it was a distance we could visit easily. Living through it, I realized just how different that was. Looking back, it would be a lie to say I have no regrets. I should have weighed everything more carefully. I should have lived there for at least a month, or even just one season. I should have experienced what the roads look like when a crash comes down, how far the emergency room is, and whether getting along with neighbors is easier than I thought. I should have experienced that village for real first, not just the rural life I see in YouTube videos. My family doesn't visit as often as I expected either. Everyone has their own life, children, and jobs. I cannot blame that reality. However, I should have known it beforehand. My plan to spend my retirement simply enjoying watching my grandchildren ended up being just a plan the moment I grew too far away. Moving to the countryside isn't bad. Country life isn't bad. The air was definitely different, the smell of the soil was nice, and the meals eaten with lettuce grown in the garden were authentic. Those times weren't all in vain. I just should have known first if it was right for me. It wouldn't have been too late to decide after living through all 4 seasons. I shouldn't have decided based solely on the excitement of spring. I should have looked first at the weeds and swarms of summer, the crashes and long nights of winter, and whether there was a system in place to protect me in case of an emergency. I learned that by paying a hefty price. I see lights outside the window again today. They aren't very visible during the day, but they light up clearly when night falls. At first, every time I saw those lights, I thought of Goseong. It reminded me of the things we had buried and left behind. But things have changed lately. Seeing those lights just puts me at ease. It makes me think, it is there, even tonight. I was able to live just by paying rent, eating, and going to the doctor. It wasn't Daewall, but this small space was warm. There is no yard, no vegetable garden. Even looking out the window, you can't see any mountains. But there are no scary nights. It takes less than an hour for Junho to bring his grandson over. That was enough. Everyone, If you dream of moving to the countryside, don't rush. Don't make a decision based solely on the excitement of spring. Try living through all 4 seasons first. If a month is too difficult, go down there every season. Pull weeds in the summer and see with your own eyes how the roads get blocked in the winter. It is never too late to make a decision even after you know where the nearest emergency room is, who clears the roads when it snows, and how long it will take for your family to arrive. Ultimately, what protects you is your own prepared choice. I hope your life becomes a true sanctuary, not a castle isolated by barriers. I hope the story I shared today has resonated slightly in a corner of your heart. I sincerely wish for peace to settle in during your later years.